Someday I'll have to have the show and tell you did. Oh, please have a seat.
Thank you.
So there's two ways we could go at today, as it happens. I'm going to do this way, but I'm going to tell you about the way we're not going, because after we're done today, if you're still interested, there's a way to carry on the conversation beyond today. The other way is actually a CBS report that features Diana Butler Bass, the author of Grounded, which is the focus of our presentation today. It features her, but it isn't exclusively her. So it picks up on really everything she's talking about here, and goes beyond it. And so I think maybe it lends itself to a follow-up conversation in a good way. Before I launch into it, though, I do want to remind you that I have a card here for Nettie, Nettie Rivera, who will no longer be our bishop by the end of Saturday, when we have a new bishop. So part of the liturgy will involve her passing off the pastoral staff, the crozier, from her to Pat. I know that was a piece that was very important to her as we thought about how this transition was going to go, that she wanted to physically hand that off to him. And so that's what she will do. And when she does that, she'll be out of a job.
I bet when she flies home, she'll feel as light as can be.
She will be full of all sorts of emotions. Knowing her, she will be. So I'll give you the card. It's been around for a while. It's got a few pages to sign on, including the back, which is still it is entirely empty. So, somebody's got to, start. So it might still be one of you. So sign the card. You don't have to say a lot if you don't want to. You can say, "God bless you," and that would be fine. So I forgot to bring a pen in, so there you have it. I wanted to spend some time on Grounded, partly because it was an important conversation we began with our Lenten book group, and partly because we didn't finish the conversation at our Lenten book group. And goodness knows we're not going to finish it here today either, but I thought it was important to carry it on, at the very least to carry on the conversation that we began. So to remind you, the Lenten book group this year was Grounded. How many of you read that book? So about 50-50 here read the book. And I anticipated a mixed audience here today. And so what I prepared for today is two parts. One is an overview of the book, so that if you haven't read the book, this will give you some idea of what's included. It's kind of a Reader's Digest, highly abridged version of the book. In fact, what I'm going to do for the first 25 minutes or so is I'm just simply going to share with you some of the quotes from the book, and allow some conversation. Those of you who have read the book can do a couple of things. You can keep me honest that, in fact, what I'm saying are the real points, because you can take quotes out of context, can't you? So to check and make sure I'm reporting things accurately, and then we'll have some conversation when this is all done. Okay? So that's the first part, is an overview, a reminder, refresher, a kickoff for people who have already read it, as well as then an overview for those of you who haven't. My best sense of what the book is. The subtitle, so it's Diana Butler Bass's book, Grounded. The subtitle, Finding God, I reprinted it here, Finding God in the World, a Spiritual Revolution. Finding God in the World is the first part of that, and that's what she says is the revolution. And we're going to come back and focus on that a little bit. One of the points that she will make in the book, and she's made in the interview that is part of that CBS special I talked about, is she'll say, we all know things have changed in the church, in the world, in the last generation. What we always assumed was true about people and people's church attendance and affiliation and all the rest, we all know that doesn't hold anymore. And it's real easy for us to kind of lament that. We look at different demographic studies. The Pew Studies is one of those groups that's done polling and a lot, and that gets talked about a lot. The largest religious affiliation in many parts of the country, including the Pacific Northwest, is a group they call the Nuns. That's not N-U-N, it's N-O-N-E. The people who have no religious affiliation. That's how they self-identify religiously. And increasingly, she's added another category, Diana Butler Bass has, the nuns and the duns. The people who will tell you, I used to go to that church, but I do not go anymore, because I am done with it. And so a piece of what's going on, I mean, this is a dynamic that anybody who's really looking at all of what's going on in this country easily understands. I mean, I've been doing this job that I do now for essentially a generation. And I know it's different now than it was when I started. And if I had been doing this for 2 generations, the differences would be in some ways more stark. But I've certainly seen things change pretty dramatically in my professional lifetime. The thing about it is that I want to start at the outset saying is Diana Butler Bass and many others will tell you this isn't a sign that the people out there, the people who don't go here, that they're bad, that they're not necessarily affiliating with a religion, but it doesn't mean certainly that they're not spiritual. And it doesn't mean that they don't share a lot of important wisdom and insights that we would do well to pay attention to. So she wants to say, this isn't the death of Christianity or of faith. It's a revolution. It's changing in ways that we have to be aware of. It isn't anything dying off, but we've got to pay attention to what's going on where the life really is. So that's it's just hang on to that a little bit, if you will. Yeah.
Right. Someone once said that about every 500 years we have a major revolution.
That's another way of looking at it. Phyllis
In the
Tickler,
church.
in her book, The Great Emergence, marks out these 500-year epochs.
That's right.
Yeah.
It won that.
So this is from her introduction. Not so long ago, believers confidently asserted that God inhabited heaven, a distant place of eternal reward for the faithful. We occupied a 3-tiered universe with heaven above, where God lived, the world below, where we lived, and the underworld, where we feared we might go after death. But that's the way the world was understood. That's where she starts. What used to be believed, and that's part of what she's saying, is we don't believe that anymore. Hardly anybody anywhere. The old understanding in its crudest form, the world of religion is to act as a holy elevator between God above and those muddling around down below. So the revolution she sees, by the way, I'll just say it now so you can look for it as we go through this, is we used to have a vertical belief in things, God above, us below, hell below us. That used to be how we looked at things. And the church's role was to make sure we got ourselves up there. And she says, it isn't vertical, it's horizontal. It's the fundamental change. That's the revolution at its essence. When the Bible is read, and this is the other side of that, she says, when the Bible is read from the perspective of divine nearness, not God up above, out of reach, divine nearness. When the Bible is read, so we're not talking about brand new theologies, it's reading the old one with different eyes. When the Bible is read from the perspective of divine nearness, it becomes clear that most prophets, poets, and preachers are particularly worried about religious institutions and practices that perpetuate the gap between God and humanity.
There's a lot of alliteration in that sentence.
Hmm?
There's a lot of alliteration in that sentence.
She prides herself in her So here's the table of contents. I mean, again, this is very much just the initial overview. The introduction is part 1 is the natural habitat, part 2 the human geography, and her contention throughout the book is this is where God is. And what's not on the list is the church. Okay? And the church, and what she'll come at it in different ways throughout the whole book, the church does not contain God. God is out there everywhere. Okay, you with me? All right. So those are the chapters. I'm going to go through them really, I'm going to try and go through them really quickly. The first section, in the natural world. Dirt. Just some excerpts. At the Methodist Church, I learned, this is the old way, this is the revolution she's talking about. At the Methodist Church, I learned to follow the rules, how to be an obedient Christian girl. But the country, the place of dirt that I had previously feared, cleanliness is next to godliness. The place I had previously feared became a school of wonder. And she quotes, what's his name? Pritchard? I can't remember his name, but it's in the book. Forrest Pritchard, yes, thank you. She quotes him. He's a farmer. And they had a conversation that she recalls in the book, page 37. There's no such thing as a secular farmer. The seasons are spiritual. The soil is, spiritual. Farmers are a spiritual lot. He's one of the nuns. I talk about nuns and duns. When she met him, she found out he was once an Episcopalian. He doesn't go to church that much anymore. It doesn't mean he's not spiritual. As he says, farmers are a spiritual lot, connected to the dirt, the soil. And this is one of those fascinating little things that she put in there. She says, if unclean and being soil become the dominant metaphors for sin, it's just a small step to the demonization of real dirt. And she in the chapter, she talks about when you say somebody or something is dirty, it's supposed to be a bad thing. And she says, Jesus is all about our getting dirty, getting our hands dirty. So it's a question of how we use and hear the word. Dirt. Dirt is where God is, she says. Okay? It's first chapter. Second chapter. Water. Walking along the Potomac, she lives in Virginia when she's home, has taught me many things. I learned that the place where water and land touch is one of the most significant geographies for our life on earth. This is a vibrant spiritual vision. Knowing God as water is not only about clarity and flow, but consists in great part of the muddiness of our own lives. So the river is a territory of doubt and desire, and we must walk through this riparian environment to reach the clear waters. Spent a lot of time talking about the ecological significance of this zone, the water and the mud meet. And then the third chapter, and I've actually devoted 2 slides to it because this is where some of the most, to my mind, gripping imagery was. To say that God is in the sky is not to imply that God lives at a certain address above the earth. Instead, it is an invitation to consider God's presence that both reaches to the stars and wafts through our lives as a spiritual breeze. For centuries, we have distanced heaven, placing it beyond reach and making it impossible to experience. If you think about it, however, heaven is not far away. We may walk on the ground, but the rest of our bodies move through the sky all the time. It's the sky, everything above the ground. God's heavenly presence is the air we breathe. I don't think she says as much about it as I might have, but she does talk about the fact that in Hebrew and in Greek, the word for spirit, ruach in Hebrew, pneuma in Greek, the word for spirit is breath and wind. And whenever you read in the Bible, whether Old or New Testament, whenever you read breath, you can translate it spirit. Whenever you read spirit, you could translate it wind. Or whenever you read breath, wind. So every time you read it, somebody made an interpreted decision when they translated it into English. But if you want to be really creative, say, well, what would it matter if they had translated it with the other words? Because it means all three, every time. It can mean any of those. And then she says this, and this is one of the fascinating, a lot of us sort of went when we read this part here. To say that God is the air we breathe or in the sky that surrounds us does not negate the mystery of God. There is another location where earth and sky touch, at the horizon. Horizons retained an aspect of mystery, even a sort of transcendence. They are never quite what they once were. They always shift. To speak of God and sky is to speak of intimacy, but it also hints at a different sort of distance as well. Not like God sitting far above the world, because that's how we imagine it. If we imagine God in the sky, when we were brought up, we imagine God way, way, way up there where we can't reach. Not to imagine God as sitting far above the world, but perhaps more like God at the horizon, just beyond what we can see. There's more. Not God above, but God at the edge of the visible world, the horizon of mystery.
That fits with the Celtic concept of thin places.
Sure. Almost, not quite. Yeah. Almost, can't quite reach it. See, it's thin, but there's still something separating. So that's part one. What did I miss? The one thing I'll tell you that I haven't even touched on in what I've said so far is she really, really, really in the book pushes that because dirt and water and sky is where God's home is, we need to take care of it. So the whole environmental emphasis, which is a major thrust of these first 3 chapters, I've just skipped over. So I admit that, Kim. What else did those of you, again, now those of you who are rested, just a quick check-in. What else didn't I say? And that was the one piece that I really need to own up to. Anything else?
Well, because I think that's set, because she emphasizes the environmental piece of the dirt, water, and sky thing, she is sort of setting the stage for the next part of the book, which is that we are a community and we need to join together to take care of the dirt, water, and sky, and then she goes into that in the next part of the book of
Sure.
how that fits
Absolutely.
together.
So the first part is natural habitat. Just to preview it, we're going to go into human geography
Right.
next. That's where God is also living.
That's right.
That more comes together toward the other half of the book.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, yeah. So, Barb, you ready?
Well, the extent to which the church clings to the vertical, which is just rampant. I mean, our hymns, our liturgy, it's everywhere. The extent to which the church clings to the vertical, Diana would say, is destructive. It's not neutral. It's
No, no.
It's not okay anymore.
No, it's not.
Which is where the nuns and the duns come in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because
That's a piece of it. Okay, so let me fast forward a little bit. It's one of the remarks I was going to make a little bit later, but it actually comes from her preface, her introduction. This is one of those quotes that just sort of, I had to stop and read it again and again and again. I have found it increasingly difficult, she says, to sing hymns that celebrate a hierarchical heavenly realm, to recite creeds that feel disconnected from life, to listen to sermons that preach an exclusive way to God, to participate in sacraments that exclude others, and to find myself confined to a hard pew in a building with no windows to the world outside. So that's what she's saying, is she finds it increasingly hard to be in an environment that enshrines in words, in hymns, in architecture, a vertical model of the church that just doesn't fit for her. And her point is, in this age, is it fitting for a lot of people? So that's the challenge she's putting before us, is what are we going to do about that? So a couple hands. Kate, I think first.
I had no hand up.
Okay, Kim had a hand up.
Yeah, and one of the things that she's talking about the nuns and the duns, she made the point that there are a lot of people who say that they are spiritual but not religious. And a lot of that comes from being out in the mountains or the water or the sky, and that people are feeling this but can't really put a word to it, like what they're feeling. And just the fact that what she's saying is that God's not up here, God is around us and in everything around us, and that's what some of the spiritual people are feeling, but they don't call it religion, but they feel it nonetheless.
And I think another piece, again, I mean, to remind us to bring it back at the end, at least, to what it means for us, is the tendency amongst clergy and others has been to look at people who say, I'm spiritual but not religious, and to be dismissive of them. And she's saying, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that. Bad on you if you do that, because what they're talking about is real. And instead of dismissing their experiences, we need to find ways to connect what we teach and believe to what they're experiencing. And in fact, we're experiencing too. And so to make connections between what we do on Sunday morning with the ways in which we live out our spirituality everywhere, every other minute of our lives. So that's the challenge she's wanting to put before us, at least implicitly and often explicitly. Can I move on to the next section? Yeah. Okay. The next section, the human geography, and this is from the introduction to the whole section. Roots, that's chapter 4. Home, chapter 5. Neighborhood, chapter 6. And the community or commons, chapter 7. These are the geographies of our lives, the places where God dwells. Chapter 4, roots. This, by the way, I stole it. I told her I was going to do it from Jeanette Beager. She posted this on Facebook. How many of you know who Jeanette is? Not as many as I would have thought. Jeanette has been coming here for quite a while. They travel a lot, so we don't see them a lot, and they also don't get involved in a lot of other stuff. But they're wonderful people. So if you get a chance to meet Jeanette and Jim, say hello.
Jeanette is somebody that if she sees somebody here in coffee hour that's new, and she's on them.
Yeah.
That is her goal in life.
So this was a picture she posted March 28th. This picture, she captioned it. She said, "A bit like my family tree. It's complicated." But I read that and I thought of this book because that's what Diana says in this book, in the chapter on roots. Honoring ancestors, she says, is nearly universal spiritual practice. You think about Asian religions. You know, you go back, you have shrines to the ancestors, and Native American religion. In biblical traditions, the call to attend to our roots takes the form of a commandment, honoring your father and your mother. Honoring our ancestors is an obligation of faith. Every family tree, this is the part that was just so wonderful, every family tree intersects with other family trees. Our roots are intertwined. We are all related to each other. We belong to each other. And by the way, I'm going to gloss over the moral force of it a little bit. But this is where, how can we afford to reject anybody else? Because we're all part of the same family.
We all came from the same place.
And it doesn't matter whether you're Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or whatever else. We're all part of that same tree. She does this wonderful thing. She says, if you constructed family trees, linearly, like we do typically, what becomes very clear is within a remarkably few generations, our roots have intertwined. Because otherwise, if you think about how trees grow exponentially, there aren't that many people that have ever lived before us. So we're all rather incestuous. It's not quite the phrase she uses, but that's what she's getting at. God is not afar off. Again, here we are, not way up there, doing stuff from afar. Not a far off weaver of the web like the earlier watchmaker God. No, God is part of the web, entangled right here with us. Chapter 5, home. The world first enters into our hearts at home, where we learn to live with others to experience the power of mercy. I keep wanting to say at its best, because I'm aware more than she was allowing, I think, the other side of that. If one learns kindness at home, it is much easier to practice kindness in the world. If one learns violence at home, it is harder to resist doing the same in the world. The table is another school for holy habits. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whose feast day, by the way, not only did he win the golden table this year, his feast day was yesterday. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote of the festive quality of the daily table. Through daily meals, God is calling us to rejoice, to keep holiday in the midst of our working day. The habits we bring to the table can make or break the party. So she's talking, in essence, in this chapter about taking those experiences at home and making them good in order that we might experience something that is sacred there, in order that we might then carry it out with us. Neighborhood. I put Starbucks there because this is her example. She contrasts two different coffee shops. And essentially the old one is the model for the old church, where, look around, folks, we're all pretty much the same. We come from the same places, we look the same, we act the same, we dress the same. And she notes that old coffee shop isn't the world that people experience in the wider neighborhoods. But Starbucks is more like it, where you have different people, different ethnicities coming in and sharing a space. Neighborhoods have always been places where people gather in small clusters. Fine line is crossed, however, when tribes become clans and neighborhoods become enclaves. and they become closed. And she says the world can no longer afford tribes intent on purity who believe God blesses only them. The world is longing for tribes that place hospitality front and center of spiritual practice and work to bless others on their way. We do not need gated neighborhoods, but neighborhoods with open gates. Okay? See how this is progressing? The logic of it all? And then commons. In early New England, the church was the largest building in town and served a multitude of purposes, some religious, some more mundane. The meeting house lot extended the sacred into the streets. And I remembered, if you know anything about sort of medieval cathedrals, you might remember that they being this big gathering space, I mean, you'd have markets. That's why, part of why cathedrals didn't have pews. You couldn't obstruct the use of it. It had to be used to bring the cattle in and the vegetables in and everything else in, and then get them back out, sweep them all up, and then you stood for services if you needed to. In a typical cathedral, at least in England, in a typical cathedral around the edge, there's a little bench built of stone. If you need to sit, that's where you could sit. But most people just came and stood.
That's what the altar rail was for, keep the cows out of the cities.
You know, that's right. The virgin with the stick. Too often, and this goes back to the quote I read to you earlier, too often I had closed my eyes while kneeling at a railing in a darkened church to receive bread and wine. But the point of communion was exactly the opposite. To open our eyes, to live in the world, seeing everything in it as a revelation of God. As a ritual, Christian communion is a path of spiritual connection with God and creation. So that's part 2, human geography. Again, the question is, what did I miss? The big topic I've missed in everything I've talked about that runs right from the beginning through the end of this book is September 11th. And she spends a lot of time talking about her experience of what happened in the world and in the churches in reaction to September 11th. And I haven't even touched on that. But that's a piece. That's a piece of what's going on in the book, because she notes that after September 11th, what happened a lot of times in the church was the same thing as was going on in some of the less helpful experiences of the world, where we became defensive and fearful, and we lost sight of the fact that our calling is to open up our doors and our arms to those who aren't like us. So that's the big piece I'll just mention that I know I missed. What else did I miss?
I just wanted to say one thing. If any of you get the paper, there's an editorial by David Brooks this morning on the editorial page that really speaks to our deep need for these things in our lives, and to have connection and grounding and neighborhood and all of that stuff, and how important that is to us, and the fear of needing to go back to another time a long time ago to get that, which is a draw for a lot of people. If we could only go back to 1950, or if we could only go back to 1960 where we were, we would have all of this. And he speaks to the fact that it's possible to do this now in 2016.
Right, and if he is, he's talking about exactly the challenge before us, especially as it relates to the second half of the book. So I have, by the way, the last one being the Commons, a bookmark I picked up when I was at Trinity Cathedral. I guess it was last fall during the conference they had, where Diana, among others, was there. And I just picked up this bookmark because one of the things they were pushing was something they called the Commons at the cathedral. It starts with sort of the mission. We hold the sharing of personal stories as sacred, no crosstalk, no giving advice, no fixing. It's a place where you come together and you get to share. And this is hard work. And I had a real hard time with that conversation because I can't hold with that. But we need to have conversations where I have to figure out how to be respectful of somebody who says that Donald Trump is the person who ought to be our next president. That's going to take work. That's a piece, again, of what she's talking about we need to be doing. That's the healing work that the church can be a part of in the world. Where it's happening in the world is where God already is. She wants us to be part of that instead of divorced from that. So, just a second, Peggy. Those who have been here part of the presentation, I really do want to give you one more chance to tell me what did I miss in my presentation. Anything else? Okay, now Peggy.
Well, what struck me when you just said that was a certain part of the Christian community says things like, we love the sinner, but we don't love the sin. I mean, that kind of thing. But at the same time, then they kind of excommunicate or separate what they say as the sinner. We have. I think the challenge is to while you disagree or whatever with whatever you're thinking of as the sin in that kind of a scenario, that you also embrace the sinner or the person with a different viewpoint as just as you do the people with the viewpoint that you have. And it's really it's a both and kind of a thing. Yeah.
It's not easy work I'm talking about, but again, this is, I think, the challenge before us. And this is the conversation we had a beginning on with our book group this Lent. But this is not the conversation we finished. We're not going to finish it today. I am bringing it back to the table because I think we need to keep having it somehow. You know, all of its different ramifications and manifestations. Okay? That's...
I was just going to add, there needs to be parameters for this kind of conversation. I'm going to be going to a brunch after this with an old friend from Ben who is a Trump supporter. And my only rule for the brunch is that we don't talk about politics. I mean, that was my rule because there are a lot of other things that I want to talk about, to explore her life and to talk about, you know, how her children are doing and all kinds of things. And the thing about politics being, it's the elephant in the room, and it can take over all of the common ground you might have in a conversation if you have a finite amount of time. So
yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, but I'm also remembering the old axiom or adage or whatever. I remember the old saying. You know, there are two things you don't talk about in polite society: religion and politics. But the pushback on that is, if you can't talk about religion and politics, can you talk about anything important at all?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think that there are a time when you don't talk about religion and politics. Not only that, but she's a Jew. And so we don't get into conversations. We do sometimes, and we often have, and we'll get into political conversations. But if there's this much time to catch up on someone's life, political discussion right now can take over anything else that might happen in somebody's life.
I understand exactly what you're saying. In this context, I understand what you're saying. I'm also saying that we, as human beings, as people of faith, and as a community of faith, have got to find ways to talk about the things we can't talk about.
Absolutely.
And I don't have an answer on that, except to say we've got to do it.
And our action speaks louder than our words. So, you know, that's another way of communicating, is how we behave and what we do.
I was going to say, I just finished a Christian ethics class, and it was interesting because so much of our discussions in the various weeks was it goes back to part one, how do we see God? And how do we interpret the message of the gospel? And I know a lot of good Episcopalians, some of them are my friends, they are as conservative can be. They may be supporting Trump or Cruz. You know, I'm not even horrified by all of that. But it goes back to how we see God and how we interpret the message of God. And to me, we have to be able to have those conversations.
I would recommend what Richard Rohr sent in his daily message today. I think it really speaks to.
Do you have it with
that.
you, or?
I do, but it's too long to read.
Okay.
Because it's a page and a half.
Oh my gosh.
But it really puts it right there, what John said. It's all about how we see God and how we see Jesus' teaching and what Paul said, and it all comes right down to that.
Here, I'll read a very short excerpt from Richard Rohr, which is part of the promo on the book. It won't really touch on the substance of it, except a little bit, because he does say something that ties in exactly with what you just said. This was his recommendation of the book Grounded. He says, "It is so delightful to endorse a book that says what you want to say, but then says it so much better." He continues, "The reversing of engines that Diana Bass describes in Grounded," revolution, right? The reversing of engines that she describes was first announced by Jesus himself, of course. How strange that it should seem so new and even revolutionary 2,000 years later.
Right.
And I did, in an earlier quote, talk about it's how you're reading these things.
Yeah.
This is nothing against what the Bible says, depending on your framework,
Interpretation.
your paradigm, your hermeneutic, and you use other big words, but yeah, go ahead.
The hardest thing for me in having those conversations is I'm tempted to just not say anything when I come up against something that I simply do not agree with. And I'm learning, I'm trying to learn to say I disagree with you.
I don't see the world that way. I don't see the world that way.
That is not my
But
belief.
that's now how I understand Jesus.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
right.
And I
and-
think it's important to say
Have it
at
in.
least that much to people, because otherwise silence is complicit.
I couldn't agree with you more. Silence, it's
odd,
when that
though.
definitive statement is made at the table and you go,
Yeah.
it's hard to respond sometimes, and then you think,
It's
I can't.
uncomfortable.
Right.
I don't think it's hard and uncomfortable are not the same thing. And we're confusing those two in this conversation.
And the point that you made it, you said it exactly, and I know that you believe this fiercely. But we need to use accountable language when we say these things. So the answer isn't, well, you're full of horse whatever. Okay? The answer isn't, you're an unfaithful, unchristian person if you can vote for Donald Trump. Though I have a hard time not believing that. Okay. The answer is that's not how I see it or how I experience it. It's not you, it's not us, it's not everyone, it's not people, it's I.
Yes.
The way I read the gospel is it's good news. You know, I'll say something like that. And so it's really doing the work you need to do. I'm using a you, but here's the thing. The calling on each of us is to do the work I need to do in order to be part of a conversation, part of a relationship. And it's got to be really clear. I have to be as clear as I can be if I'm going to do that authentically as well, to be able to say, this is the work I've done, this is how I come out, this is where I am, this is how I see things, this is what I believe. Without, even if it's profoundly different from what the other person is saying, without saying to that other person, and you're full of that.
Well, avoid
The word accountable is very good in there, Father Jed, and I think the word civility goes along with it too. You can speak out and still be civil and show some empathy on the other side.
And here's, I'll go right back to the baptismal covenant, and that's part of the calling. Will you respect the dignity of every human being? It's just one of the foundational questions for us. Yeah.
One of the things that I've done with friends and what I do, and other friends have done with me and taught me, is to say, it's okay for us to disagree. I don't have to agree with you.
Absolutely.
And it's simple, and it seems to be effective so far.
I absolutely. I have a hard time believing that, but okay. I mean, I'm just honest. I struggle with all of this, and I think, I suspect if we're all honest, we would all agree with that. It's a struggle for me to say, I really do respect what you're saying, because I have a real hard time respecting what some people say.
You don't have to respect it.
Yeah.
No, I don't. Yeah, and that's another thing. And that's where the language may be a little muddy. I want to quickly come at the questions that are left before us, or at least some of them. Yes, Kate, go.
I think that a lot of people vote and believe out of a wound, and I think it can be helpful to find some way of finding the wound, because then, since we're all wounded, that's a way of connecting with people who have very strong disbeliefs, very strong beliefs opposite ours.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think my own feeling belief is that a lot of what's so destructive going on in our country, profoundly since September 11, 2001, but I think it's deeper than that even, is the fear that drives so much of contemporary politics. I think particularly on the Republican side, but I don't think any of us necessarily let ourselves off. So there you have it. That's kind of how I'm looking at it. You don't have to agree with that, and we can have another session on all that some other time, maybe. We have to move on. I have some questions. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say, there's a wonderful book that, if you've ever trained for Stephen ministry, is called Speaking the Truth in Love.
Yeah.
And it's about how Jesus spoke the truth in love, and how there are practical guidelines in how you can have these conversations. And one of them is to use the I word.
Yeah, and that's fair. And to that point, we might recall that Jesus wasn't always nice.
No, he
And he
wasn't.
didn't respect every other opinion going out there in the world. He took exception with a lot of what people were saying, teaching, doing. All right, questions, and I'm going to have to pretty much just leave us with it. This is where we could have had another half hour or 3 days or 3 years of conversation. These next, just quickly, 5 questions that seem to me to warrant some conversation. How do we get our hands dirty? I kind of mean that literally and figuratively.
Jump in and do it. Don't wait, just do it.
But if we're going to have the conversation, the question is how do we get our religion out of the clean indoor spaces and out into the world? How are we as a church going to get our hands dirty? Where can we find mud and earth to dig in? And Kim might be helpful in this. Okay.
I was going to say, if you look at this month's trumpet, April is Earth Month, and there are 28 different events going on in the community, brought to you by COCC and the Environmental Center to check out. We've already had food and agriculture, but the next couple weeks focus on energy, transportation, water, global consumption, and waste. So it really can help you understand some of the issues that she talks about in the first 3 chapters of protecting the earth. So the poster's over there, and you can go to the website.
Second question, we're not going to answer it today. What does hospitality look like for us? And implicitly beyond that is, what would it really take for us to be truly hospitable? It's more than being nice when somebody walks in. It's also actually letting them change. If I were preaching on Acts today, which I'm not, if I were preaching, and it's a longer passage than it has to be, but I couldn't leave it at the first few verses where Paul gets blinded and we don't know how the story plays out. If I were preaching on Acts today, I would tell you there are 2 conversions. It's Saul's conversion and it's Ananias's. And the more important part for us to pay attention to is Ananias's. And I'll tell you the word to hit on that reading, when you read it, is when Ananias goes to Saul, having already said, he's the one out there trying to kill us all, and God says, go anyhow. You know the first word out of Ananias' lips when he goes to Paul? Brother. Brother. That's what hospitality looks like. Okay, I'm not preaching on that. You just got the only sermon I have on Acts today. Related to that a little bit is, are we just another tribe of people who look like us, think like us, do like us, are like us, or are we something more? Related a little bit, what does it mean to be a neighborhood church?
Starbucks.
A place like Starbucks. If you go to, even our little Starbucks here, if you go to Starbucks any day of the week, there's a lot more diversity there than there is here.
Drop by this morning.
I'm not talking about just dropping up, picking up your coffee and leaving. I'm talking about actually being there.
They're having church.
They are. That's right. Well, that's a good point. They're having church, and that's their sacrament.
Exactly. I'm telling you.
How can we create a common space? Those are the implications of that book, which we barely touched on today, and even over the course of reading it over 5 weeks. So those are some of the questions that I just put before you. And this is again from the intro. It's only page 24. The introduction to the whole book. She says, this is about people who are out there, if you will, the people who aren't part of the church. We are not lazy, self-centered, or individualistic church shoppers. We are heartbroken by the fact that the faith traditions that raised us and that we love seem to be sleeping through the revolution. Where do we go from here? Well, I have run a little long again. I have church in about 7.5 minutes. Some of you will be joining. Thank you. Some of you.